Yo, what is going on everybody? My name is Dominic from Dominic Talks Movies, and today I'm going to be ranking all of my favorite decades in film. If that sounds interesting, let's get right into the video. According to YouTube statistics, a whopping 57% of you that watch my videos are not subscribed to my channel.
What? What the
If you're one of those 57%, please consider hitting that subscribe button and turning on that notification bell, because I post daily movie content like reviews, rankings, and video essays. So if you really enjoy that kind of content, then you're definitely gonna love my channel, so definitely consider subscribing. But with that being said, let's get right back into the video. Hello everybody, my name is Dominic and I love to talk about movies. If you love movies too, then you're going to love my channel and definitely consider hitting that subscribe button. Today I'm going to be ranking my favorite decades in film, and this is going to include every decade on this list will be a decade that has at least one film included in my top 100 movies of all time. So that will include every single decade except for the 1920s and the 1910s. But without further ado, let's get right into the ranking. Now, to determine what my favorite decades were and to determine how I will rank them, I put in place a little point system. Now, I don't necessarily need to disclose what that point system was, but I would just say that depending, like the higher up you are, so I would say my top 5 gets the most points, and then anywhere from 5 to 10 would get a little less points, and so on and so forth, like that, going from like 10 to 20 and stuff like that. So basically, the further you are down the list, the less points you would get. And with that being said, let's hop right into it. In last place is the 2020s pretty easily, because the only film on my top 100 in the decade of the 2020s is Tenet. And it was pretty far down my list. I only gave it around 5 points. So that's the only film that we only get 5 points total for the decade. Very poor performance, but you can't really expect much more. And yeah, so the 2020s come easily in 10th place. Coming in at number 9, I have the 1940s. Now, this is definitely a good decade for film. I think it has some super classic films and some underrated films, one of which I will talk about a little later on. But this was definitely a lower decade. I think that there are some good films. There are 2 films on this from the 1940s that got 15 points each. In total, the 1940s got 32 points on my scoring system. And I think the 2 standouts for this decade were Citizen Kane, which got 15 points, and Bicycle Thieves, which I think might be the most overlooked film of all time. It is honestly one of the best ever, I think, objectively speaking, and I don't think enough people have seen it. So if you haven't seen Bicycle Thieves, I highly recommend you check it out. But it definitely got 15 points for the decade, but in total, it just couldn't catch up to the other decades. Coming in 8th place, I have the 1930s. Now, another great decade. I think I prefer this decade for sure in terms of pioneering specific genres. I think the one that stands out the most, obviously, is the horror genre, with the Universal classic monsters beginning in this decade. I think I have to give some big props to it. In this decade, there were 2 standouts, being the original King Kong and the original Frankenstein, which both got 15 points for the decade. But in my scoring system, plugging in the 1930s, I gave the 1930s a total of 42 points. So a full 10 points in front of the 1940s. And that's basically it. King Kong and Frankenstein are the standouts for this decade, and it comes in at 8th place. Now we have a tie for 6th place between the 1950s and the 1970s. Now, in the 1950s, there were a few standout films. First off, you got 12 Angry Men, which got 25 points for the decade because it is pretty high up my list. I think it's in my top 20 of all time. And then it had a bunch of movies that got 15 points, a few including Tokyo Story, Mon Oncle, and Vertigo. And then in the 70s, Suspiria also got 25 points for the decade because it is in my top 20. But it also got a bunch of 15 pointers, including A New Hope, The Godfather, and Barry Lyndon. Now, if I were to choose one of the decades based on the films that are inside the decade, I would have to put the 1970s slightly above the 1950s, just purely because of the classics you have on that list, like A New Hope and The Godfather. But other than that, I think I'm going to keep them at a tie. Plugging the 1950s and the 70s into my system, I got 111 points total. Now, coming in at 5th place, I have the 1980s. Now, this is a decade that was carried by the very, very top films. You have the two films being The Empire Strikes Back and The Shining, which both got 50 points for the decade. Those are both in my top 10 of all time, so those were the big hitters of the 1980s, and they got the majority of the points. Now, in total, plugging the 1980s into my system, I got 154 points for the decade, coming in around 40 points more than the 50s and the 70s. So that's the 1980s in 5th place. Coming in 4th place, I have the 2010s. Now, there were a bunch of standout hard hitters in the 2010s. A few are Whiplash, which is in my top 10 of all time, Wolf of Wall Street, La La Land, and It's Such a Beautiful Day, which are all in my top 20 of all time. So in total, that gets the decade 150 points. And then there were a bunch of other movies. So in grand total, plugging in the 2010s into the system got 250 points, almost a full 100 points ahead of the 1980s in 5th place, but that's the 2010s in 4th. Coming in at number 3, I have the 1990s. Now, there was one specific really big hitter in this decade, which was Pulp Fiction, and if you know me, you know I love Pulp Fiction. It is in my top 5 of all time, so that got 100 points for the decade. Then you got The Shawshank Redemption, which got 50 points for the decade because it's in my top 10, and Good Will Hunting got 25 points because it's in my top 20. Now, in total, the 1990s barely scraped past the 2010s with 252 total points, only beating out the 2010s by 2 points. So a really close race, but the 1990s is in 3rd place. Coming in at my number 2 spot, I have the 1960s. Now, the reason for this one being placed so high is for two specific hard hitters at the very top. We got Playtime and Psycho, which are both in my top 5 of all time. So those both get 100 points for their decade. Then you got 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is in my top 10, giving it 50 points. And Planet of the Apes, which is in my top 25, which is in my top 20, giving it 25 points. But in total, the 1960s made a big jump over the 1990s, a total of 30 more points at 282 total. But coming in easily at my number 1 spot is the 2000s. Now, same with the 1960s, this had two huge hitters, Fantastic Mr. Fox and Return of the King, both scoring 100 points for the decade, since they are both in my top 5. And then you got Mysterious Skin, The Dark Knight, and The Incredibles, all scoring 25 points for being in my top 20. In total, the 2000s blew every other decade out of the water. It even outscored the second place 1960s by almost 80 points, finishing with a grand total of 360 total points based on my points system. Now, to quick recap, in 10th place I had the 2020s pretty easily, only having one film. Then the 9th place goes to the 1940s. 8th place goes to the 1930s. There was a tie for 6th place between the 50s and the 70s. Then in 5th place was the 1980s. In 4th place was the 2010s. In third place barely was the 1990s, second place was the 1960s, and far and away in first place was the 2000s. And that is going to do it for this video, guys. If you agreed with any of the placements of these decades, definitely let me know down in the comment section. If you enjoyed the video, definitely leave me a like down below and subscribe to my channel. And if you want to see more rankings like this involving certain decades in film, I will definitely get those videos out doing either top 10s or top 15s or even top 20s favorite films of certain decades. So if you want to see those videos, also let me know down in the comment section. But that's going to do it for me, guys. I will see you in the next one.